certainly I would want to correct perhaps the misapprehension that equality involves treating all protected groups the same.
It's time to have another look behind the scenes at the Scottish Parliament, what goes on in those committee rooms, and what you watch in this video, I'm sure you'll agree, is quite remarkable. Now, this is related to the terrible hate crime, hate speech bill that's going through the Parliament at the moment. I'll just give a bit of background, is that there's got these sacred protected characteristics included in the bill, like LGBT, race, etc. But the obvious one to include as well, normally what would be included would be sex or gender. So therefore you could have a hate crime motivated by being anti-women or anti-men. But oh no. The feminist group said we can't possibly have that. What we want is a law where it's only a hate crime, or it can only possibly be offence to do something motivated by antipathy towards women. We don't want anything that's sort of hate crime against men. You can just forget about that. It only needs to protect women. Now I would say it's pretty obvious. Even if 99.9% of so-called hate crime was committed by men against women, which that's not the case at all, but even if it was, that's not an excuse for having a law that only deals with one side of the issue. I mean, it's completely ridiculous. It's like having a new law that deals with football-motivated violence, and then the Rangers fan club went to the government and said, no, we don't want that. We want a law that only deals with violence by Celtic fans against Rangers fans. Nothing about the other way around. And if the government were to say, oh yeah, that's a good point, we'll go with that, you'd say Rangers have clearly got undue influence with the Scottish government, wouldn't you? But what's happening with the bill is they've left sex or gender out of it for the time being, and they've set up a group to look at the possibility of a different crime, a misogyny crime, hatred against women. Now, what we've got in this video is mainly Emma Ritch of the Engender taxpayer-funded feminist organisation, who's trying to justify this blatantly sexist law. Now, she said there at the beginning, different protected characteristics should be treated differently. Now, in a sense, she's right. You build a ramp for disabled access, but you don't build a ramp for different races. So on a sort of trivial level, she is correct. But she's taking that trivial point and extrapolating it to justify this wildly sexist new law that's been developed. So here we're going to see Emma Ritch in full flow and speaking totally unopposed. I mean, here's an example of one of the MSPs responding. This is where there should be analysis and counter-argument, but instead we just get this sort of thing.
Thanks very much for that, Emma. That's very, very helpful indeed.
So let's hear the case for the sexist law.
It's fundamentally contradictory, according to the analysis of violence against women that Scotland uses, to say that some incidents of violence against women are a product of discrimination on the grounds of sex or animus on the grounds of sex, and some are not. That's just not how we understand violence against women. And so that really does lead to the potential for Equally Safe, our world-leading violence against women strategy, to be undermined by such an approach.
Do you get that? She said, we've defined violence against women as an expression of sex discrimination. They've defined it as that, even though it's obviously not true. For example, some violence against women is committed by women. Some violence against women is committed in order to steal things from them. Even, for example, sexual violence, I would say a lot of the time is motivated by sexual gratification rather than hatred or discrimination against women.
The second risk we see is that Scotland is broadly committed to a bunch of human rights frameworks that are really ambitious for women's and girls' equality and rights. And those, including those set out by CEDAW, by the Istanbul Convention, the Council of Europe instrument on violence against women, are crystal clear that the presumption should be against gender-neutral laws which protect men and women in exactly the same way. And they are strongly of the view that if you have this symmetrical approach to incidents of violence against women, that is likely to harm women.
Okay, killer argument number 2. Some other international agencies share this ridiculous definition of violence against women. Therefore, we need to do the same thing. Now, this suggestion that symmetrical laws increase violence against women So if the law defends men and women equally, that results in more violence against women. Does anyone really genuinely believe that? It's completely ridiculous. That's a case of academics torturing the data for long enough, and it'll tell you what you want to hear.
It will be another tool for perpetrators of domestic abuse to use in their abuse of women. We are very, very familiar with perpetrators accusing women of abusing them as part of their controlling of women. And
okay, argument number 3. So the law should only offer special protection to women because otherwise men, also known as perpetrators, men, it's the same thing. Otherwise men will make false accusations against women. I mean, obviously it's utterly impossible for a woman to make a false allegation against a man. We don't even need to consider that possibility.
In over 20 years, New Jersey has operated hate crime law, and in that time they have seen 18 reports of sex-based hate crime against a comparative 6,810 for race-based hate crime. So what we're seeing is that this just isn't a model or a concept that really does anything to address gender-based violence, women's violence against women.
Right, argument number 4. I mean, by that logic, you could say something like this. There's a law against driving tanks on public roads. There's only been one prosecution for it in the last 10 years. There's a law against speeding. There have been 245,752 prosecutions for it. That clearly shows that the law against tank driving is ineffective. Might it not just show that there actually aren't many crimes that are actually just motivated by hostility to women? Might that just be a possibility?
There is some data out there which suggests that women are having an almost universal experience of public sexual harassment.
Right, number 5. Universal harassment. In other words, virtually all women harassed in the public sector. I thought the public sector was where it's full of equality and diversity officers. Well, I mean, that's almost all women. That is just not true. But even if it was, so what? Some men might be harassed for sexist reasons as well, so why not have the law protecting both?
I think we're also increasingly seeing very, very serious links between misogyny and terrorism. And some of those have been picked up by bodies that are expert in looking at terrorism. We've seen some murders in 2014, 90 murders and significant injuries are attributable to what is known as incel ideologies, which is a subsection of misogyny. And we've just seen this year federal authorities in Canada bringing terrorism charges against a young man who murdered and injured women in a machete attack, which they also attributed to this incel ideology.
Right, incels. Incels, basically normally young men who can't get a girlfriend. They've often got other problems in their life as well. They become very bitter and aggrieved and develop a grievance against womankind, stoking up each other's bitterness on the internet. That has led to some violent attacks. Normally the people involved in that, there's the sort of sad loners, maybe on cannabis, existing mental health problems. But the problem with this incel ideology, or this expression of it, is that these young men blame their problems on the opposite sex in general, as though the opposite sex was some homogenous group with a united agenda to make them miserable. I mean, that's a really unhelpful way of thinking, isn't it? It's really divisive. It's inevitably going to lead to grievance and bitterness. I mean, Emma, you'd never see the world like that, would you? You'd never see it as a battle of the sexes, would you?
I mean, I think we have a general interest, as all citizens do, in seeing stirring up offences in part to balance the need to protect minoritized groups from hate with the need for persons, especially those from marginalized groups, to articulate their views, including feminist speech. We've all defended organizations that advocate for equality and rights, causes that are sometimes unfashionable. Sometimes there is offence caused to some groups.
Right, number 8. So sitting there we have Emma Ritch, paid by the taxpayer to express her personal opinions as a feminist, and those views coincide exactly with the government, but she thinks feminists are a marginalised group. So as far as she's concerned, the real freedom of speech concern about the hate speech bill is that feminists might be getting arrested for hate speech. And you can imagine it coming, can't you? I mean, rarely a week goes past without a story in the newspaper, something like, you know, doctor struck off for saying gender pay gap needs to be closed. teacher fired for saying masculinity is toxic. I mean, she just seems to live in a fantasy world.
But I do think that we have an opportunity here, again, to lead the world.
That phrase should strike fear into the heart of every Scot, because it normally means Scotland is doing something so extreme that no other country in the world has managed to delude its population to the extent required to get away with it. But anyway, what you see in this video is just another day in the Scottish Parliament. Feeble arguments left standing unchallenged when they should have been shut down in short order by anyone present with a modicum of critical thought. Thanks for watching.